You're now empowered to make yourself a great GM. We now need to move on to aspect 2, which is creating a world space that is going to make your GMing even better. Hello, my fellow GMs. Welcome to this week's episode of How to Be a Great GM. We are talking about aspect 2. That's right, the second aspect. So the first aspect was all about you developing yourself mentally as a GM, getting yourself prepped and ready to take on the mantle of being a GM. We now move into aspect 2, which is your world space. Now, your world space is the gaming space in which everything will take place. From all of the NPCs, to the towns, to the geography, to the planets, to the solar systems, to the nebula, everything that goes into your game, we call the world space. Before we jump into today's video, let's talk about how you, as a GM, can help prepare your gaming space to be more efficient and to help you run a better game. We're going to do that using ultimategamemakers.com. Now, ultimategamemakers.com sent me this package of ledgers which they make, beautiful transparent ledgers, which, as you can see, you put up your GM screen and boom, you are hanging these ledgers, and they do all kind of wonderful things. They hold cards, they hold minis, they hold all kinds of things. Really, really useful range of things to have. If you are like me and you like to have a lot of these things at your table, it's really, really, really convenient to be able to just sort of hang it over certain areas. You don't often use this part of the GM screen, or you don't use that part. And rather than having it cluttered around the space behind the screen or on another separate table next to you, you've suddenly got these ledgers, and booyakasha, everything is sorted, kept in a nice place, easily organized, and you can see through to the rules underneath if you really need to. Really, really awesome concept from ultimategamemakers.com. Check them out. Now, back to the video. We need to create a world space that is going to give us constraints, and we know why we need constraints. If you don't know why we need constraints, go and watch a video from a week or two ago. Constraints are going to give us the power to create a world space that makes sense, but also a world space that is going to give us even more constraints. We want those constraints to help us when we are making decisions. We want those constraints to be useful to us. We want them to be tools that we can use as our players are exploring our world space. And I want to emphasize this, as we, as the GMs, are exploring our world space, because we will be exploring our world space along with our players. There's no ways that we can create absolutely everything that will be in our world space before we start. And you're going to see a little bit later on when we get to actually world building, we're not going to do that anyway. Consciously, we're not going to do that anyway. So we are going to be going on a journey. We need to make sure that that journey is constrained. So when we look at world spaces, when we start even thinking about designing our own world space, we have to start somewhere. And that is, in my opinion, we have to set ourselves some goals. We have to set ourselves some goals. Now, those goals could be quite literally anything. So we're going to constrain them down, and we're going to come up with some goals that are going to help us to really drive and give us some inspiration and support as the game goes along. So our very first goal, and I know that this sounds weird in terms of how do we get to our goal, is our very first, let me not say our very first goal, let me say our very first step, is we need to choose our RPG system. This needs to happen before anything else can happen. Now, you might have already got an idea in your head for a campaign or for a game where you're like, oh, I want to play Star Wars, I want to redo The Mandalorian, whatever. That's fine. That will help you with step 1, because that will give you a limit that will constrain your choices to what system you're going to be using in order to play your game than The Mandalorian. But if you are creating a world space, and you're maybe starting from scratch, you don't yet have an idea for a campaign, you don't yet have an idea for adventures, you kind of got some things in your head, choosing your RPG system is going to really help focus you. It gives you a major constraint. If you choose something like Dungeons and Dragons, that's fantasy, that's magic, that's dragons and orcs and elves and dwarves and all the wonderful new races that they've added in between. That's a whole lot of constraints in terms of existing worlds. We're not going to get there just yet, but it comes with a whole bunch of prepackaged stuff, and it comes with a whole bunch of open stuff as well. You don't have to use one of the pre-generated worlds. You can make your own. Aha, that's interesting. Whereas, say, for example, if you choose Call of Cthulhu, your world has kind of been almost predefined. World of Cthulhu, whether it's a medieval setting or a modern day setting or a Victorian setting, it kind of relies on the fact that Cthulhu is a central figure, maybe not necessarily in your campaign or in your adventure, but the pantheon that Cthulhu is part of is kind of integral to that role-playing system. Yes, you could replace the name of Cthulhu and say, you know, we're not playing Call of Cthulhu, we're playing Call of Brian. Not that there's anything wrong with Brian per se as a name, but that's going to change the whole kind of mechanic. And you're like, well, why would then you use the Call of Cthulhu system if you're going to change everything to Brian? Maybe you could just use the D20 modern system. So look at your role-playing system, look at whether it supports the idea that you already have, or if it is going to help you to create new ideas and new spaces. You might want to use a pre-generated world and say, hey, I want to play a game of Star Trek in the Star Trek universe. And I'm going to choose the, let's say, I'm going to choose the Discovery universe because that's, you know, a new series that's busy running and is cool and is filled with amazing stuff. We're going to play in that universe. That's pre-made for you. But there's a whole bunch of things that are going to come up with that, and you're going to see that in the next couple of videos, is whether we want to pre-make our world space, or whether we want to use an existing world space, or whether we want to kind of make it up as we go along. These are options that are available to us depending on the role-playing system that we're using. So again, we choose our role-playing system. That gives us a whole lot of constraints, a whole lot of expectations, which we know are super powerful when it comes to creating our goal. So that's the first step. The second step may sound odd, and it might also be difficult if you don't already have a group in mind who will be playing the game. But the second step is to choose, or not to choose your players. You will have your players, and you can choose your players, absolutely. But the second step is to ask your players what kind of game do they want. They might say, you know, a fun one. That doesn't help you. Narrow it down by asking them questions. Would you like a game that involves a lot of combat? Some players might go, yeah, I love combat. I think that'll be cool. Aha, a constraint has been added to our catalog. You might get players going, actually, you know what? I would quite like a political campaign. New constraint added. Maybe they want a campaign that's focused around the player characters rather than on an epic story. Whole bunch of constraints added. Epic campaign, player-based campaign, sandbox campaign. Those are a whole different kettle of fish altogether. But they're constraints that are being added to our list. This is what we like. Yes. Maybe they say, I want to explore relationships. I want to have a wife, or I want to have children. I want to build a castle. I want to take over the galaxy. I want to explore the galaxy. I want to become a god. Take everything they give you. Ask questions. Well, would you like to become a god in a modern day setting? Would you like to become a god in a fantasy setting? You can direct them. You can guide them. And never be afraid, by the way, to ask you yourself what type of game you would like. There's no point, absolutely no point in saying to your players, hey guys, what type of game do you want to play? And they all go, oh, I definitely want to play a Gummy Bears based campaign from the 1984 comics cartoon series. And you go, no, I hate that. But by giving them the choice of gummy bears, you now kind of oblige that they're going to have their hopes pinned on gummy bears. So constrain them. See what I'm doing here? We're giving them constraints. Say to them, guys, I would like to play a fantasy game or a sci-fi game. Those are the two kind of games that I'd like to play. So when someone goes, oh, I want to play an apocalyptic game, you can go, listen here, Peter. We're not going to be playing apocalyptic because I said fantasy and sci-fi. Oh, well then, fantasy. See, there we go. You made the right choice. Well done. See, you can hear the cooking. Right. So we want to make sure that we are creating a space that our players are going to want to be in, but that we as the GMs want to be in as well. It's important to get that feedback, and they might give you very different feedback. That's not bad. It's not bad to be told that you are going to run a campaign that has combat, NPC dialogue, adventures, riddles, puzzles, a little bit of politics, and some cloak and dagger. That's pretty much every campaign out there. But at the same time, it really constrains you to be able to then, when you are designing adventures, go, oh, well, I know that my players wanted all of these things, so maybe this adventure should be more politics focused. And then the next adventure can be more combat focused. And then the next adventure can be more NPC focused. Look at what happened. These constraints have now given us 7 adventures without even thinking about it. This is genius! Or something that you've already been doing forever and is just helping to clarify and cement in your mind that these constraints are really helping us to create adventures and stories and kind of all kinds of cool stuff without us even having to work for them. All right, so get your players' feedback, get your own feedback, figure out what kind of game they are looking for. And that takes us to step 3. Step 3 is what I spoke about kind of at the beginning of the video, your goal. Your goal. You couldn't decide on a goal at the beginning of the video because, well, we didn't have enough constraints. We now do, however, have our constraints. We have our RPG system, and we have what our players and what ourselves kind of want in terms of the story or the bigger kind of picture. We now need to create a goal. Why? What is a goal going to do for us? Goals are particularly important because they give you a benchmark. They give you a point around which you can test every single idea that you are going to have for the rest of your game. Your goal could be, I want to run an epic campaign. That means when you are dealing with adventures that pertain specifically to your epic campaign, your epic story idea, those adventures need to be epic. So you can't really have the nemesis that they're fighting be a damp squib or literally just live in a very small space and have very limited powers and die very quickly when the player characters kill them. That's not epic. Epic would be a titanic battle of huge forces and magic and power and all kinds of things coming together in the most climatic way possible. All that kind of stuff. I mean, folks, I've written a whole book on how to create epic campaigns. That's how important an epic campaign is. It gets its own book. An epic campaign requires certain things. It gives you constraints. You have to have certain things, otherwise it's not an epic campaign. But remember, this is a goal that you're setting for yourself. So you could set any kind of goal. I want to run an intimate campaign where it's just the party and they're struggling to survive. This is more about the party versus the world than the party taking on all kinds of things and saving the world. This is about the party saving themselves. You could decide that your goal is to make sure that it's not boring. That's a very big goal. It's a very common goal. A lot of GMs, I'm worried that I'm boring. Your goal could be to not be boring. How do you measure whether you're boring or not? Well, you have to have it as something that you can measure against first. So your definition of boring is, well, I want my players to have fun. Okay, let's try and unpack that a little bit more. You need to be very specific when you're setting your goal. Okay, I want my players to come back to my table every session and I want them to be energized. Okay, so that means you want your players to be engaged in the story. You want them to be asking questions outside of the gaming session. That would indicate to you that you're not boring. You unpack your goal. I want an epic campaign. I wanted this. I wanted that. I want my players to be shocked. I want my players to fall in love with, well, not the players, but the player characters to fall in love with NPCs, which by default, folks, is the players falling in love with NPCs. All of those kind of goals are good, but they are only useful if you unpack them in terms of giving yourself targets. I want the party to fall in love with NPCs. Okay, how do you fall in love with someone? Well, they've got to have certain attributes that you find admirable. They've got to be useful to you. They've got to have certain quirks and things that make them different from the average other person. Why would you fall in love with that peasant as opposed to that peasant? Well, that peasant's endearing. That peasant is helpful. That peasant is optimistic or is useful or et cetera, et cetera. So by adding in an understanding of your goal, you are creating a whole lot of constraints. And you go, well, the next time the party encounters someone, I'm going to try and create an NPC that is endearing and that is loving and that is kind and that falls for one of the PCs. Will the PC fall for them? Well, I've got to figure out how to get that. I've got to figure out the buttons to push. I've got to design adventures that will entrench that. Look at what's happening. You are getting adventures for free because of your goal. Goals are really, 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 really useful. They're really powerful things for us to have. And when we combine those goals with the role-playing setting, with the RPG setting, your goal might be to really know the rules well of the RPG setting that I'm using. That's not a bad goal. And that does, by the way, still translate into adventures, because now you're going to take that rule book, read a new rule, and figure out how to incorporate it into an adventure. Or how does an adventure come out of that rule is the right way of saying it. So if you've got a thick rule book with hundreds of rules, you potentially have got hundreds of adventures as you are exploring each rule as it goes along. That's really, really powerful. Okay, next up, combining it all together. When we combine them all together, we suddenly have a big ball of constraints. We have our goal. Our goal we've broken down into multiple little steps, so we know what we can actually measure against. We're going to be measuring, by the way, folks, every single session. Look back. Did I achieve my goal? Please, please bear in mind that there are times where you will fail because you try something. You're like, oh, I really wanted this to be epic, but somehow the PCs got around it and it ended up being not so epic. That's okay, because what it does is it says to you, okay, next time, now you can try to do something bigger or to try and bring it back to being epic. Now you can try and do X or Y to try and get moving, to try and advance your goal, to try and get back to your goal. If your goal is about using the rules and you make a rules call and you forget what the rule is that you base the entire adventure on, well, now you can come back to it and go, okay, well, I didn't get it right. I'm going to try again. Maybe not next adventure, because then you've had the same adventure rule kind of coming up twice, maybe in 3 or 4. But you need to have those things in order to be able to look back and to guide yourself. You have your players telling you what kind of adventures they want. So if you're looking at your goal and you're looking at what the players are wanting, you go, well, my goal can fit into an adventure that will satisfy one of the players' requirements. That is phenomenal. Your players are going to be so entrenched. They're going to be going, oh, this is exactly what I wanted. And you're sitting there going, ha, ha, ha. It's also exactly what I wanted. Hey, we're both winning here? Surprise, that's the whole point of the game, kids. So look at the power that we have by taking those 3 little steps in creating a goal for ourselves. And then, of course, you add in the role-playing component on top of that, the role-playing system and all of the rules that come with it and all of the expectations that come with it and all of the constraints that come with it. And by establishing our goal, we have created a giant bubble in which we ourselves are in. We're inside a bubble, folks, and that bubble is our constraints. And now we're going to fill it up with more constraints, and eventually we're going to get to a point where something happens in the game. We really are not trying to create anything. We're just pulling that constraint, that constraint, that constraint, pull those 3 things together. That gives me that answer in this particular situation. Booyakasha, here is my instantaneous answer, even though it feels as if I just made it up on the fly. I didn't. I just created a space in which my world space and my mind space were in alignment and we're helping support each other. Hopefully. Anyway, that's it from me, folks, for this week. A massive, massive thank you to ultimategamemakers.com for sponsoring today's episode. Huge thank you to our patrons, of course, who support the channel and keep it going. And to all of you for watching all the way through until the very end. Until next week, I wish you and yours the happiest, yes, that's right, the very happiest of gaming.